and welcome to In the Spotlight with Quocirca, the definitive podcast on digital disruption in the print industry. I'm Louella Fernandes, Director of Quocirca, and today I'm joined by Paul Birkett, Head of Digital Services at HP. Today we're going to be discussing software innovation and the opportunity around employee experience and engagement. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we've got quite a lot of different areas to cover. So welcome to the show, Paul. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks, Louella. Lovely to see you again. It's been a while.
So yeah, we've met many times over the past several years, and you've been in various roles. So it would be great to hear a bit about your career history today, your different roles, and also your role at HP today.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I've been in the printing industry for over 30 years now. And during that time, I've held various roles. I started with a scholarship from Xerox. And stayed at Xerox for about 26 years, and held a number of roles there, culminating in leading global business development for our managed print business, or for the managed print business at Xerox. And I then moved to Samsung, where I was heading up sales and marketing for the European printing business. And when Samsung's printing business was acquired by HP, I moved to HP, and have been at HP now for almost 4 years. And during that time in HP, it's a very dynamic company, which is really great. I've held 5 different positions, and managed to get a very broad cross-set view of the organization, from onboarding the Samsung European business, which was very much about core management of distribution, supply chains, channel onboarding, etc., going all the way through to looking after the commercial software business, all of our software partner programs, and software sales on a global basis.
Yeah, so as I said, the topic of the conversation today is around software and software innovation. But I'm curious because obviously you said you've been in the industry over 30 years. How have you seen the industry change in terms of those dynamics, in terms of moving from hardware to services and now to software, and what are some of the challenges that you see with that in the industry in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I used to talk about actually when we were doing big training events. That the industry is incredibly flexible, and it's one of the things that I love about the print industry. We've faced existential challenges probably every 5 to 7 years, and the industry always manages to redefine itself to meet those challenges. And if I think back, the shift to digital from analog was the first one that I experienced. And the whole, rise of the MFP, for want of a better term. The shift to color was another major shift and dynamic move that forced the industry to have to really learn new technologies and skills. And then, of course, the shift to services. And the shift to services has kind of carried the industry really for the last 15 to 20 years. When you think about that, the print industry was actually quite a long way ahead of other elements of the IT industry, which have kind of migrated only in the last 10 years to more of a services model. What we're now seeing is perhaps the biggest shift there's ever been. And it's been accelerated by the last 2.5 years of the pandemic. We're seeing a migration to digital working. And that's being driven largely by changes in both the location strategy of employees now being based in a much more distributed fashion, and also I guess you could call it the need to drive and deliver experience to help employees connect and collaborate more effectively in that more distributed model. It's kind of flipped the whole concept of IT from being very much the realm of the CIO and designing technology which works to run a process, to actually being in the realm of the line of business and technology existing to ensure the employees can get the work done. And that pivot we're seeing in the market is also impacting print, because print volumes have declined fairly dramatically in office spaces. Very fortunately at HP, we have quite a highly leveraged business. So, we have a very large home printing business, and print in home printing environments rose significantly during the pandemic. And now we're all waiting for that normalization, Louella. We're all looking to see what the new models will look like And what we're beginning to see, which is both interesting and also quite exciting, is it varies by industry and it varies by market. So the UK, for example, which I know is where you are right now, is incredibly hybrid oriented. People are, working in a hybrid mode, working from home, working from the office, across many different industries. The further east you go, the less that model holds. And the more you go into developed markets, again, the less that model holds. So this is the next big shift we're going to have to see. How do we serve the hybrid worker? And how do we ensure that the pivot from physical paper to digital working is something that the print industry can participate in?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, you hit on a great point there that the kind of return to the office and the hybrid work really is having an impact on the print industry, because what we're seeing is that difference in how employees are working, and that shift has really, or the power shift has really moved from the employer to the employee. So organisations are really under a lot of pressure now to make sure their employees are engaged and productive, and they have to have the right workplace tools to make sure that they can attract and retain talent. And the reason I wanted to have this podcast with you today is because I think you're doing some really interesting and exciting things around analytics and understanding workplace productivity and employee engagement. So could you maybe share a bit more around what HP is doing in that area, particularly around some of these kind of adjacent areas around employee experience and engagement?
Definitely. Well, it's a great topic, because one of the things that we were noticing even pre-pandemic in our interactions with clients and also in the research we were conducting was this beginning of a shift in power back to the line of business through almost citizen-led development. You've only got to look at the Microsoft Power Suite, for example, and see the capabilities in there and the rise of robotic process automation to realize and understand that you no longer need IT to develop line of business applications and solutions. There are thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them on the market, all of them tailored uniquely to certain tasks and activities. And the ability to customize and create suddenly goes off the scale. So what we saw was this shift in the power distribution, where IT was orchestrating and supporting the development that was being managed and designed by the line of business. The really interesting thing that's also led out of that is this focus, as you said, on engagement. Because one of the things that did definitely happen during the pandemic is people became less engaged in the business. And what I mean by engagement is they weren't connected to the business purpose anymore. They didn't really understand how their work helped the business to achieve its objectives and outcomes. And a lot of the traditional models around people management began to fall apart. Even, people that had weekly one-to-ones said they didn't really feel connected anymore. They felt isolated. They felt their work didn't mean anything. They were simply sitting in front of their desk every day on conference calls for 12 hours and not achieving anything. This feeling has led to probably one of the fastest rises of a new software industry that I've ever seen, which is this whole human enablement element of the software business. And it was kind of an incubation phase before the pandemic. It exploded during the pandemic. And now what we're beginning to see as we enter the hopefully post-pandemic phase, fingers crossed, as we enter the post-pandemic phase, organizations are beginning to restructure to actually optimize this new need that they've seen in the business around employee engagement. So, for example, how effectively are employees communicating with each other and collaborating? How do we measure that? How do we know when people are having problems, and how do we support them? How does the work contribute towards the business? And I don't mean an annual appraisal, which was the old model, because I don't know about anybody else on this podcast, but my objectives change on a monthly basis these days, but sometimes on a weekly basis. And this agile approach to work, where you're working in much shorter sprints, often with diverse teams, really drives a different type of demand for how you measure performance. It's no good saying once per year, I expect you to do these 6 things. Doesn't work that way anymore. What we need is a much more dynamic approach to how we connect outcomes to work and ensure the user feels supported during that process. And we're seeing a development of a whole ecosystem of new management tools that do that. And the final piece is that purpose piece. How do we help people to feel they have purpose in their work? Because actually, that's why you get up. That's why you put in the extra hours. It's in the research that's being conducted, it's not actually about the pay for most people. People get up and do the extra work because they want to, or they feel they want to support their colleagues or the business objective. So how do we help people to understand and really connect to that in new ways? And these are the key areas of development and research that we found. And we're seeing a whole new software ecosystem open up in this space, which is really exciting. So at HP, obviously, we're looking at what role we play in that, which is incredibly exciting because it brings us into new diverse customer conversations and opportunities to support and help.
Yeah, I think, we've heard a lot about the great resignation or the great reprioritization. It's come under sort of many different names, but I think, even in our research, we saw that I think it was around 40% of employees are planning to leave their jobs within the next 12 months. And like you say, the top reason isn't because of salary. I mean, obviously that is sometimes the motivator, but often it's because they want a better work-life balance. They want to be more productive in their roles and so on. And I think it's really interesting that you say that this whole new ecosystem is springing up in terms of helping organizations track and understand how their employees are actually working. Yeah, so digital services are really key here. So can you maybe share with us a bit about what HP is doing in terms of its strategy and any partnerships?
Yeah, certainly. So when you think about the need to understand how effective the worker is, one of the elements that you need is data and telemetry. And we've been working really hard to help get the data that we can collect from our endpoints, which actually are interaction points for the user. I know they're touch points that the user accesses every day at work, whether it's a PC, whether it's a conferencing facility, whether it's a printer, doesn't really matter. They're tools they use to work. How do we not just collect telemetry on the device, but how do we also understand what the user is experiencing? And we've been building a whole suite of platforms in our business to enable us to ensure that data is both collected, anonymized, and also usable in a way that enables us to define and understand good and bad patterns of working. So a good example of that, if you look at our device as a service business, for example, we have a customer insights platform, and the customer insights platform helps us to have a touch point to the user to understand the sentiment that the user is experiencing with different parts of the technology stack that they're using, be it a specific piece of software, their PC experience, etc. And in print, we've been looking at it from a slightly different angle because we believe that the telemetry, the data will point to a potential issue. It doesn't answer what the cause of the problem is. And normally a business would recruit consultants to go and collect that information, or they would have managers form project teams and spend 2 months collecting extra information, interviewing staff and trying to find out what the problem is, with an objective of creating a project to fix it. We believe we can dramatically accelerate that process. And we've been creating a new platform, which is designed to help us to engage the user, the end user themselves, that experiences the problem, in a short discovery exercise that will actually map out the process that they're doing and the work that they're completing and where it's going wrong for them. And the cool thing is we can then use that to connect to a whole portfolio of solutions on the back end, business solutions on the back end, that will fix that particular problem. So getting away from these big monolithic change programs that users hate, and actually moving to a more agile and adaptive process where we're able to fix particular point issues within the user base using off-the-shelf software.
So that's really on the analytics side, because I think it's interesting that analytics has always been the real sort of foundation for, if we think about NPS and how to really optimize those engagements and have a really comprehensive understanding of how businesses are using their print devices, but also business workflows. So does it potentially somehow feed into NPS? Because NPS is very mature now and almost commoditized in terms of the base services. So do you see an opportunity potentially for the channel to use these kind of platforms to get a better understanding of how their customers are using devices?
100% yes. And in HP, we've been focused on the print telemetry for some time. So we have a service offering called SDS, which is smart device services. And what that does is it's a cloud connection to the device that's constantly monitoring the telemetry from the device itself. Of course, as print workflow migrates to the cloud, the actual printing content migrates to the cloud, you can also begin to intuit intelligence from the types of data, the times that people are printing, the locations that people are printing from. And you can start to use that data at the macro level to begin to understand behavior patterns that may be problematic. So we may be seeing that a certain percentage of people are reporting dissatisfaction with their work life through that insights platform that I was describing. And when we look, we're actually finding that on the time they're most dissatisfied, which is a Wednesday and a Friday, they're actually in the London office. Okay, what's going on there? And this is where the intelligent transformation platform would kick in and automatically message those individuals and say, hey, we've created this. It creates a problem statement or a challenge statement that says employees aren't enjoying the London office. And we think it's something to do with, the commuting time or something similar. The challenge statement is then mailed to select individuals that have identified it as a problem. And they are asked a very short survey question. That then triggers a whole bunch of what's called a network effect, where the answers begin to spread out and you begin to start to form a picture of what's causing the issue and dynamically maps the problem statement and the process in real time. And this concept of taking away the need for highly skilled consultants to do this kind of work and having the machine learning do this kind of work and the customer drive it themselves, we believe is a big disruption point coming in the tech industry for how you plan change.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually to sort of understand, because you talked earlier about kind of business outcomes focus, and I think that's generally what we're seeing, that shift in terms of how technology buyers are looking for when they procure any kind of big sort of IT system or platform. And it's interesting that you talk about the sort of the analytics and understanding the actual processes. So it's not just about the device and how that device is being used, although that's part of it, I guess. It's actually being able to then, I guess, use predictive analytics to actually potentially understand where kind of those kind of bottlenecks are and what's perhaps leading to that employee dissatisfaction. So like you say, it's a completely new area. And I was just curious because often in the industry you get sort of very traditional print and NPS resellers and providers. So do you have any advice or recommendations for them in terms of how they can actually utilize that in their when they're talking to their customers? Because I guess typically they're very traditional in terms of the kind of sales process they go through around NPS, but it sounds like there's opportunity to expand into this kind of workplace analytics and employee engagement as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Louella. So I think the first piece of advice is to get interested in data. I know it's not the most exciting topic in the world, but once you begin to look at the data you have on your clients, you begin to understand there is rich value in that to help you to advise your clients what to do better and what to do next. So the first observation I would give to anyone in the print industry is get excited about your data and look at it as a business asset that can be mined and managed to help your client base and therefore to generate incremental revenue or profit. The second element that I would recommend is the print industry is a sales machine. It always has been. But the sales machine targets the point of sale when the customer signs the contract. These new models don't work like that. If you listen to many of the people that study this area, they'll talk about a landing, i.e. getting the customer, is just step one. Actually, driving adoption, getting people using printing, getting people using the things that you provide is a much more important step than the signing of the contract. Because only in that do you deliver value to your customer. And once you have that, the data can lead you to expansion. What are the areas that you can spin into which enable your business to keep growing with that client? And the concept of customer success is something I think every print reseller and supplier should be looking at in their client base. How do we ensure customers are successfully using what we've delivered? And how do we drive further success for the client by helping them to adopt new technologies and capabilities and services that extend our relationship and therefore the value we're delivering even further? And of course, out of all of this comes an ever increasing outcome for the client for its relationship with you as a provider.
Yeah, and I think that concept of land and expand, is it? That, I think it's really critical to the print industry, because I think there's always been that need to move beyond MPS and whether it's into solutions and services. But I think this creates even more opportunities once an MPS provider can really understand their customers' workflows through analytics and actually taking that step further to kind of employee satisfaction, productivity, and engagement. And I think, like you say, data is absolutely critical to that whole kind of process. And customer success. We're seeing a lot of this customer obsessed focused on from the kind of big tech cloud vendors like Amazon, and that's really what their kind of the mantra is. And I think that whole kind of focusing on business outcomes is perhaps something that maybe traditional print providers haven't really focused on so much in the past. And having these kind of software tools makes a lot of sense. So just based on that, in terms of HP's strategy going forward with these kind of platforms, can you give a bit of insight into maybe timescales, where you are with your strategy and whether there'll be any sort of commercially available platform in the near future?
Yeah, certainly. So the first element I would say is, how do we get to that point where we have a core service, which is printing? How do we have a core service that actually drives higher levels of customer engagement and also drives the data that we need so we can begin to do that adopt and expand model in a quantifiable way? So we've just released a service called Managed Print Flex into select markets. We're going to be expanding that market coverage as we go through this year. And the concept behind Managed Print Flex is creating that first bridge point. One of the things that we noticed was the printing experience for many people was not good. In fact, it's a meme, but it's actually probably a reasonably accurate meme that the printer never works. And you've all seen the comics and the comedy sketches, etc., with people smashing printers. We need to take notice of that. We've got to fix the core experience, because in that core experience of printing, that loop that a user gets involved in of, I have work to do, my work involves a document. I can either find a way to do that digitally, which could be pretty painful as well, or I can print and simply have it seamlessly integrate back with my digital world, is the core definition of where print success in the future needs to be. It's just a medium that people use to consume information. We need to make the production and consumption of that medium so incredibly slick that it becomes a natural choice for the user over picking up their cell phone. And in that, there is a whole bunch of work. And with Managed Print Flex, we're looking at how do we create that? And it means a more curated experience. So again, think more like an Apple experience of how you are onboarded into an ecosystem. And that ecosystem then begins to understand you and introduce more things in the ecosystem that can help you. And that's the model we're going for with Managed Print Flex, is to onboard somebody into an HP ecosystem that enables them to then consume further things, but it also enables them to understand what's going on much more clearly than they could in the past. And of course, that means cloud connectivity. Of course, that means advanced data collection and analytics. But it also then begins to mean, for example, cloud printing. Because in cloud printing, we can begin to understand what you're printing, where you're printing, why you're printing, when you're printing. And that data is also incredibly rich for a business to be able to understand key working patterns of their workforce.
I suppose the opportunity around print, it's very much seen as a utility because, it's just something that should work and doesn't always work. And I think, like you say, the perception is that the user experience may not always be great with printing, but it's really many organisations are still hugely reliant on printing. And in our research, I think it's still around 70% of organisations still depend on printing. And I think there's this kind of myth of the paperless office, but that's just not going to materialise. Definitely we're moving to a less paper office. But I think, some of the points you mentioned there around how to make that user experience more seamless and actually integrate it into a broader ecosystem where then, like you say, with cloud printing, with how do you get those users onboarded into other areas of that ecosystem? And, it can, I do think there is opportunities for print vendors to really build their relevance beyond print, but print being the kind of foundation that actually extending that to the workplace, particularly with hybrid work now, how do you ensure productivity through the cloud and so on? So so I just really wanted to sum up really, because I think it's really interesting to hear some of those, thoughts around HP strategy beyond print, but still kind of tying it into print as the kind of foundation. But what are your views on the future of the industry, not just only with print, but some of these other opportunities in adjacent areas, whether it's cloud, cybersecurity, sustainability? Even, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, first of all, I've got complete confidence that once again, the print industry and the print providers across the world will adapt and will find where they fit with this new way of working that's beginning to emerge. We've done it before, we will do it again. I think that future is going to be cloud connected. I think increasingly, and I think the statistics that I saw was about by 2026, 75% of print workflow is expected to have migrated to the cloud. In the same way that it did for lots of other traditional work-based activities. So I think that will be in the cloud. So we need to adapt to understand the cloud and to understand the security models that are needed for the cloud, zero trust models, etc., will become a critical component of security conversations as we go forwards. We also need to really look at the core loop of printing. There's nothing wrong with printing. Printing as an activity helps people to connect better. It helps people to create more effectively. And it helps people to share in situations where sharing on electronically is actually more difficult. And I'm talking about manufacturing lines, even down to meetings. Depending on, the generation of the people in the meetings, you can find there are very diverse needs in the meeting that paper meets immediately. So I think we need to make the core loop of printing simpler. We've got to aim for those high bars that have been set by the leading tech companies in how their experience looks and feels. And right now we're a long way short of that. And I think that's an OEM problem. It's an OEM and a software problem. It's not really a provider problem. It's not one of the channel's problems. And then the final piece, I think, is, as I said, we've got to shift to this concept of customer success, not just focus on the upfront sale, but focus on the value delivery to the client and how we can use data to move the conversations with the client into other areas of the business. And that could include things like digital workflows. It could include software automation technologies. It could lead us even into the early part of the conversation we had, Louella, which was on how do we help to drive employee experience in different ways? Or it could just lead us to more IT support services. And all of that is okay, but choosing your path and building from that core loop of print into that path is going to be essential. So you can design your market fit correctly. You can design your product market fit correctly for what your solutions will look like within your client. I think all of that put together is absolutely essential for the future of print.
Yeah, and I think, just talking about, companies really how to future-proof their businesses, and it's really all about how they make that journey from traditional MPS to some of those adjacent areas. And I think, like you say, great points you made on, analytics being really key to that, and, really sort of the channel really needs to better understand their customers, and they can do that, with the help of analytics. So, it'd be really, interesting to follow HP more on in terms of how it helps its channel, but also, in terms of its own solutions in this space. So, and I think, in terms of the future of print, just to pick up on that, I think, over the past year, I think we've been all sort of glued to our screens, and I do believe that print is still value in terms of just switching off from the screens and, so, helping with digital fatigue. And, I certainly have been printing a bit more over the past 6 months or so, just because it just gives me a break from the screen. So I think, print's not going anywhere, but it is going to be changing in terms of how it's being used. So, I think organisations will always have that kind of reliance on print to a certain extent. So, but no, it's been really great insights. Really appreciate you providing an update on what HP's doing. And I just had a final question, just a light-hearted one. So I don't know whether I told you I was going to ask you this actually, but what was your first ever job? So I know you mentioned you had a scholarship, but your job with that. And what did you learn from it?
So I worked on Xerox's technical help desk. And I supported a product which was codenamed Meridian. And I was the first person in Europe to be trained on it. I was very lucky that I got this training. That product turned into DocuTech, which obviously went on to define changes in the publishing industry. What I learned was, first of all, about myself, that I loved how technology interacts with people and how people perceive and use it. I love that whole side of the tech industry. And I learned that during those days. What I learned about business, I had this romanticized idea that the tech was everything. And even though I was in a technical support role, talking to print service providers about their business, and realizing how much of an impact it had on them financially helped me to understand that, these are businesses, not just technology, and therefore the business has to be successful. And so many times I think we get so caught up in the technology, we forget the fact that this is a business and the business must be successful. Otherwise, there's no need for the technology. So the commercial element of it became really interesting to me while I was in that help desk role.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I think it's all about, like you say, the application of technology and, picking up again on, customer success and how the two fit together. So, no, it's great. Well, thanks ever so much again for joining me today, Paul. Look forward to speaking to you again in the near future.
Thanks, Louella. Take care.
So thank you for joining today's episode of In the Spotlight with Quocirca. For more information, please go to quocirca.com and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in our next episode.